And we're back. Wubba lubba dub dub. In this segment, now we're going to be talking about functions and grouping our results. Access has several built-in functions that are just part of the software, and they do different things. And so some of the ones that we're going to talk about right now are aggregate functions, meaning that they kind of look at all of the records for the column specified. And so these particular functions take one single column or one single field as an argument. And so the way, the basic format of a function, how it looks, is we have the function name and then we have a set of parentheses. And so the argument that we pass into that function is going to be a single column or a single field. And so that's what we put inside the parentheses. That's what we refer to as an argument. And for those of you that are going to get into programming a lot more, you're going to become very familiar with functions and arguments and passing in values and things like that. And so we've actually used a function before in, I believe it was the first module, right, where we used the is null. And so we had the criteria of is null, and then we passed in that column name, that field name, inside the parentheses for is null. Well, we're checking to see if the values inside that field are null, right? So we're looking at all of the records inside the specified column, and so that's why it's an aggregate function. And so some of the common ones that you guys are going to see here are, what you see on the screen there: average, count, max, min, and sum. And so the average is going to look at all of the values of the field that we specify, and it's going to calculate out the average. Count is going to look at all the values inside that field, and it's going to give you just that. The count is going to give you the number of entries that are in that field, essentially the number of records. Max is going to look at the values, give you the highest one. Min is going to look at the values and give you the lowest one. And then sum is going to look at all the values, and then it's going to give you all the values added up together, right? And this is not to be confused with count, where count will give you the number of entries in the column. Sum is going to add up all the values of all of the entries. So when we're using aggregate functions, we also need to kind of plan out and decide how we want to group our records, our results. And we need to group them together in some way, because if we don't, they're going to look at each record and kind of treat it individually. And so what I mean by that is these aggregate functions, right, are looking at all of the data inside that field. So if we're trying to figure out, say, the maximum value of a field, if we're treating each record separately, it's just going to return every single record, because that one record is going to be the max, it's going to be the min, it's going to be the average, right? So we need to group them together somehow so that we can determine a maximum amount or an average and things like that. Let's take a look at this in action. So I will create my new query again. I'm going to use the employees table. And so I'm going to specify the title and the salary. And I'm going to use salary twice because I'm going to use two different aggregate functions here. And so in order to use these aggregate functions within Access, within this query design view, what we first need to do is add in, so down here in the grid view, we have our field, table, sort, show criteria. We need to add in our totals row. And to do that, all we need to do is just come up here to the show hide section and just show the totals. And so we can see that row has now just been added in. And then by default, it's grouping by that field. So we obviously can't group our records by multiple fields because that would be impossible to do, right? So we're going to have title be how we're going to group our records, our results, and then we're going to use some aggregate functions on the salary field. So this first one, all we need to do inside that totals row, it's group by default. If we just select it, we're going to see a lot of those common aggregate functions that we talked about earlier. So for this first one, we'll just select average, and then the second one, we'll select count. And we're running them both on the same field. So let's run this and see what it looks like. All right, so there's our results. We can see we get a much shorter list of results because we've grouped the records together. And so we've grouped them by the title of the employees. And so we have our group of titles here in the first field. In the next column, we have our salary. That's the average aggregate function. And so what this is doing is it's looking at all of the front-end developers and it's calculating out the average of all of their salaries. Same with programmers, it's calculating out the average of all of their salaries, and so on and so forth. And then the last one is the count function. And so this is just counting the number of records inside of each group, meaning that if we look at database developer, because we have a count of 2, that means that we have 2 records that have database developer for a title, meaning that we have 2 people in that position. In programmer, we have 8, right? So we have 8 programmers. Their average salary is $6,050 per month. And so when we use those aggregate functions, the field that was created kind of gives it a pseudonym, kind of makes it up, but you can specify that name, that field name if you want, by following the same method that we did in a previous segment. But that's using our aggregate functions and grouping our records together, because if we didn't group them together, right, we're going to have a list of, not just people grouped by the title, but we're going to have, people separated by names and things like that. So it's going to look at all of them individually. So some of these aggregate functions we need to group together before we can use them correctly. And I can just show you that really quickly. If I go back and if I try to remove the group by, right, and run it, it won't let me. It's going to give me an error saying that, I'm trying to use an aggregate function within that totals row. I need to have it grouped somehow by some field. If I just try to remove it completely and run it, now it's going to look at all of them together and it's going to just give me, the average of everybody, right? It's going to give me the count of all of the records inside of that table. It's going to give me, it's going to look at every single record. So we need to group our data so that we can get the most refined and accurate information that we're trying to get from our data. So I'll go ahead and change this back. Oops. Group by, good. All right, so yeah, without a grouping field, it's just going to summarize all the records inside there. That's what we just saw. We can even then further refine our results by adding in criteria to our new grouping and aggregate functions. And to do that, we're going to use the keyword of where. And when we get into actual SQL language, you're going to become very familiar with the keyword where. There's like three main components to writing a SQL statement: select, from, and where. And so where is where you set up your condition, right? So if you say want to return only the records of an employee whose salary is over 60K, right? You can use that keyword where to create that condition. And so let's take a look at that and how that looks in Access. I'm just going to start from a fresh query because that'll be easier. Still using employees. Great. But now I'm going to use a salary field and the hire date. And so for this example, we're going to use the keyword where to specify criteria where we're trying to figure out the total monthly salary for all of the employees that were hired before January 1st of 2020. So the first thing that we have to do is add in our totals row again so that we can use our aggregate functions. And so because we're trying to figure out the total monthly salary for all employees, for the salary field, we're going to change this group by to sum because we want to total all of the salaries up. And then the hire date, we're not actually going to look at the field. We don't want to return the hire date. We just want to use it as the condition for our search, for our query. And so we're going to change group by to that keyword of where. And then inside of our criteria is where we're going to specify the criteria that we want to match. And so because we want to look at all of the employees that were hired before January 1st, 2020, we're going to say less than. And then whenever we put in a date with the where clause, we need to surround it by hashtags, pound symbols, whatever you want to call it. The text calls it something crazy. Octothorpe symbol. Yeah, let's call it that. But when we're putting in a date, we need to enclose it inside of that. So there's my Octothorpe symbol, and then we're gonna put in January 1st, 2020. And then the closing Octothorpe symbol. And so again, we're just saying less than January 1st, 2020, meaning any date before that date. So again, this hire date field is just setting up the condition of the results that we want to return. So we're saying only return the records of the employees that have a hire date before January 1st, 2020. And then look at all of the salaries of all of the records returned and then run the sum function on all of the records that were returned. So this will tell us the total monthly salary of all the employees that were hired before January 1st, 2020. And then I've unchecked the show button there because we don't really need to see the hire date. We're just using it to set up that condition. So let's run it and take a look. And there is the total monthly salary of all the employees hired before January 1st, 2020. So that's pretty great. So there's that. That's what that looks like in our SQL view. There's that where clause right there. Again, those three main keywords when we're writing out our SQL statements, select, from, where. Again, you're going to get really familiar with those. All right, so that's pretty great. Yep, the where keyword, date surrounded by, pound symbols. Yep, text surrounded by quotes. We saw that before when we used the isNull function, right? We specified, or excuse me, not isNull. When we used the criteria, we used the word database and we put quotes, but we saw that Access automatically put the quotes in there for us. It does the same thing with the pound symbols, so that's pretty nice of them. But that's using criteria through the where clause in order to refine our results even more. And then, yep, there's a screenshot of exactly what I just showed you. I think it's sometimes better to see it actually get set up from scratch instead of just seeing the screenshot. So that's why I kind of like to show you going through Access, because hopefully it makes a little more sense. But that's aggregate functions, grouping our records together, grouping the results of the records that are returned, and then even fine-tuning the results even more by setting specific criteria for the records to return. So that was a lot of useful information. I hope it was beneficial to you guys, and we'll see you next time.